We will explore the invisible ceiling that governs income long before skill, intelligence, or opportunity begin to matter. Most professionals interpret income as a rational outcome of education, performance, and market demand. Yet across corporate America, a quieter pattern appears. Individuals with comparable competence cluster within remarkably similar earning ranges for years, sometimes decades, despite operating in dynamic industries. This stability is rarely explained by capability alone. Instead, income tends to organize itself around identity equilibrium, the psychological boundary of what feels normal, deserved, and internally believable. A professional may intellectually desire higher compensation, broader influence, or accelerated financial growth, but the nervous system prioritizes familiarity over expansion. The mind unconsciously regulates decisions so that external success remains consistent with internal self-definition. Income, therefore, behaves less like a reward and more like a reflection of who you believe you are allowed to be within the economic hierarchy. For many professionals between their late 20s and mid-40s, especially those who grew up in middle-class environments, early financial conditioning quietly shapes this boundary. Childhood exposure rarely involved extreme wealth. Stability, responsibility, and modest upward mobility were emphasized instead. Success meant security, respectable employment, and predictable progress. These values create disciplined, thoughtful adults, individuals capable of sustaining demanding careers, but they also embed an implicit model of appropriate success. Without noticing, many professionals pursue advancement while simultaneously preserving psychological continuity with their upbringing. They aim higher, but not too far beyond the identity they recognize. When compensation begins to exceed familiar reference points, subtle resistance emerges. Opportunities requiring greater ownership, visibility, or asymmetric risk begin to feel disproportionately uncomfortable, even when logically attractive. The discomfort is interpreted as caution or practicality, yet its origin is often identity protection. What makes this ceiling difficult to detect is that it does not appear as fear or insecurity. It appears as reasonableness. The professional declines a high-variance opportunity because stability feels wise. Negotiation intensity softens because maintaining relationships feels mature. A promotion is pursued carefully rather than assertively because humility feels authentic. None of these behaviors are inherently flawed. In fact, they are often socially rewarded. Yet, collectively, they maintain alignment between income and self-concept. The identity quietly asks a stabilizing question: does this level of wealth still feel like me? If the answer is uncertain, behavior adjusts until internal coherence returns. Over time, compensation stabilizes not at maximum potential, but at psychological comfort. This explains why income plateaus frequently occur even among highly capable individuals. The market continues to offer possibilities, industries expand, and peers occasionally leap ahead financially, yet personal earnings move incrementally. The limitation is rarely conscious ambition, it is identity inertia. Humans construct continuity narratives about themselves: reliable professional, thoughtful contributor, stable provider, balanced achiever, and those narratives exert powerful influence over economic behavior. A dramatic income increase would require rewriting that narrative, and rewriting identity demands emotional energy. The brain prefers predictability. Predictability reduces cognitive load, preserves social belonging, and maintains a coherent sense of self. In this way, financial ceilings function as psychological stabilizers rather than external barriers. Another subtle mechanism reinforcing this ceiling is social mirroring. Professionals calibrate success relative to peer groups formed through education, industry entry points, and early career environments. When income remains roughly aligned with peers, the identity experiences confirmation. When income diverges dramatically upward, social comparison shifts from belonging to differentiation. Unexpected wealth can create distance from colleagues, friends, or even family narratives. The mind anticipates this social friction long before it occurs, leading individuals to unconsciously moderate ambition. Remaining within a recognizable range preserves relational harmony. Thus, income becomes socially regulated as much as economically determined. There is also an emotional dimension rarely discussed in professional life. Earning significantly more than one's internal identity can comfortably hold introduces exposure. Greater income often implies greater responsibility, increased scrutiny, and a shift from execution to influence. Many professionals are exceptionally skilled at performing roles, but less psychologically prepared to inhabit positions where decisions shape outcomes at scale. The hesitation is not incompetence, it is identity lag. External opportunity evolves faster than internal self-perception. Until identity updates, expansion feels like impersonation rather than growth. The critical insight is that effort alone rarely breaks an income ceiling. Professionals often respond to stagnation by working harder, acquiring additional credentials, or optimizing productivity. These actions may improve performance, but do not necessarily alter earning trajectory because the governing variable remains unchanged: self-definition. Income expands sustainably only when the internal narrative expands first. When individuals begin to perceive themselves as value creators rather than role occupants, negotiations change tone, opportunities appear differently, and risk tolerance recalibrates naturally. Behavior shifts not through force, but through alignment. Recognizing this dynamic can feel quietly unsettling because it suggests that financial limits are partly self-maintained. Yet, this realization is also stabilizing. If income reflects identity, then transformation does not require dramatic reinvention. It requires observation. Notice where decisions prioritize familiarity over possibility. Notice where modesty becomes self-containment. Notice where rational caution consistently protects existing comfort rather than future capacity. These observations are not judgments. They are data points revealing the psychological architecture beneath earnings. The identity shift that changes income forever does not begin with ambition or strategy. It begins with awareness that financial reality mirrors internal permission. When professionals understand that their earning range has been shaped as much by who they believe themselves to be as by what the market offers, a different kind of thinking emerges. Calmer, less reactive, more deliberate. Income stops appearing as a distant target and starts appearing as an adjustable consequence of identity alignment. And once this recognition settles, the ceiling that once felt structural begins to reveal itself as psychological, quietly awaiting revision. Next, we begin to understand how the concept of enough becomes the quiet architecture governing financial decisions long after basic stability has been achieved. Among high-functioning professionals, the word enough carries moral weight. It signals balance, maturity, even self-awareness. To say, "I make enough," often feels like a declaration of groundedness in a culture frequently criticized for excess. Yet, psychologically, enough is rarely a purely rational calculation. It is an inherited threshold, a boundary formed by upbringing, peer norms, and early career benchmarks that quietly defines the upper limits of what feels appropriate. For many upper middle income professionals, enough was unconsciously calibrated during adolescence. If household income during childhood supported safety but not extravagance, then financial aspiration was shaped around incremental improvement rather than structural transformation. The implicit narrative becomes do better than your parents but remain recognizable. Surpass but do not depart. As adulthood unfolds, earnings increase steadily, yet the emotional definition of enough often remains anchored to those early impressions. Once income exceeds the highest figure ever observed in one's family system, an invisible milestone is reached. Beyond that point, expansion can begin to feel abstract, unnecessary, or even destabilizing. This is not a lack of ambition. It is identity preservation disguised as sufficiency. The mind equates continuity with safety. If your internal model of success was comfortable professional with respectable income, then achieving that level produces psychological closure. Additional earning potential may still exist in the market, but the urgency dissipates. Opportunities that could significantly alter trajectory are evaluated through a different lens. Is this worth the disruption? The question seems practical, yet beneath it lies a deeper inquiry. Is this consistent with who I believe myself to be? Professionals often assume that desiring more income automatically generates behavior that supports it. In reality, desire and identity operate independently. One can intellectually want greater wealth while emotionally preferring stability. This split explains why many capable individuals hover within a narrow compensation band despite expanding experience and opportunity. When presented with higher-paying roles that require geographic relocation, public leadership, equity risk, or entrepreneurial initiative, subtle resistance emerges. The mind generates rational counterarguments: lifestyle balance, stress management, reputational risk. These concerns are valid, yet they frequently mask an identity that is not fully aligned with larger scale. The architecture of enough is also socially reinforced. Peer groups exert gravitational pull. If most colleagues earn within a similar range, upward deviation introduces comparison tension. Extreme divergence can alter relational dynamics, shifting conversations and expectations. Humans are deeply attuned to belonging. The nervous system reads financial differentiation as potential social isolation. Without conscious awareness, professionals may unconsciously calibrate ambition to maintain alignment with their reference group. Enough then becomes a social equilibrium as much as a financial one. There is also a subtler psychological element: moral positioning. Many thoughtful professionals distance themselves from overt wealth pursuit because they associate extreme financial ambition with greed or imbalance. This internalized narrative constrains possibility. If high income is subconsciously linked to moral compromise or personal distortion, then pursuing it creates cognitive dissonance. To resolve the dissonance, the mind lowers the ceiling. It redefines success in terms that feel ethically coherent. The individual remains financially comfortable, socially respected, and internally consistent, but economically capped. What makes this dynamic powerful is that it feels reasonable. It does not feel like fear. It feels like maturity. Yet when examined closely, enough often reveals itself as a boundary that was never consciously chosen. It was absorbed. It stabilized identity during formative years and continues to operate long after circumstances have changed. The professional who once needed security now possesses it, yet the internal threshold has not recalibrated. Growth potential remains constrained by an outdated emotional benchmark. The identity shift begins when enough is examined without judgment. Instead of asking whether current income is sufficient, a deeper question emerges. Is my definition of enough rooted in present capability or past familiarity? This inquiry is not about rejecting contentment. It is about distinguishing chosen sufficiency from inherited limitation. When enough evolves from a defensive boundary into a conscious decision, income behavior changes subtly. Negotiations become clearer. Risk is evaluated more objectively. Ambition feels less like transgression and more like expansion. Ultimately, enough should be dynamic. As skills compound, networks strengthen, and leverage increases, the internal threshold must update accordingly. If identity remains fixed while capacity grows, tension accumulates. Professionals sense underutilization yet struggle to articulate its source. The ceiling is not visible in performance reviews or market reports. It exists in the quiet architecture of what feels appropriate. When that architecture is consciously redesigned, income is no longer capped by inherited comfort. It becomes aligned with present capability. And that alignment marks the beginning of lasting financial shift. Now the perspective shifts toward one of the most influential yet least examined forces shaping long-term income: middle-class conditioning. Many professionals currently occupying stable, well-compensated careers were raised inside environments defined not by scarcity but by careful management of uncertainty. The dominant lesson was not how to maximize wealth, but how to avoid financial instability. Security was framed as achievement. Reliability was framed as virtue. Risk was something intelligent people minimized. These lessons produced disciplined adults capable of sustaining demanding professional lives, yet they also established psychological guardrails that quietly regulate earning potential decades later. Middle-class environments tend to reward predictability. Education functions as protection. Credentials serve as insurance. Career progression follows a visible ladder rather than an open landscape. Success becomes synonymous with progression inside established systems rather than ownership of outcomes beyond them. By early adulthood, many professionals internalize an unspoken contract: work hard, perform consistently, advance gradually, and stability will follow. This contract works exceptionally well for reaching upper middle income status. What it does not easily produce is nonlinear financial expansion. The difference lies in how risk is interpreted. Financially transformative opportunities rarely resemble traditional career steps. They often involve ambiguity, asymmetric payoff structures, or delayed validation. Equity compensation, leadership exposure, entrepreneurial initiatives, or platform-based influence require tolerating uncertainty without immediate guarantees. For individuals conditioned to equate intelligence with caution, these environments can feel psychologically misaligned even when objectively advantageous. The hesitation is rarely conscious fear. It is identity coherence. Choosing predictable advancement feels like remaining responsible. Choosing exponential opportunity can feel like violating an internal code of prudence. Professionals frequently describe their decisions using strategic language. Timing is not right. Market conditions are unclear. Stability matters at this stage of life. Yet beneath these explanations often sits a deeper identity boundary, the belief that one should not risk what has been carefully built. The irony is that once financial stability has been achieved, the original protected behaviors may begin limiting further expansion. The strategies that ensured success in early career stages become constraints in later stages. Psychological safety becomes economic inertia. Another dimension of middle-class conditioning involves authority perception. Many professionals grow up observing wealth as something possessed by distant figures, executives, founders, investors, or public personalities. Wealth appears external, almost categorical. One becomes successful by working with such individuals, not by becoming one of them. This distinction subtly shapes ambition. Professionals aim to be excellent contributors within systems rather than architects of value creation. Income grows accordingly, tethered to compensation structures rather than ownership structures. This conditioning also influences negotiation behavior. Individuals trained to value fairness and cooperation may unconsciously avoid asserting economic leverage. Negotiation feels confrontational, even when expected. Asking for substantially higher compensation can feel socially disruptive, as though it threatens relational harmony. The professional remains respected, reliable, and well-liked, yet consistently underpositions their economic value relative to market impact. Over time, these small adjustments compound into significant income differences. Importantly, middle-class conditioning does not reflect weakness. It reflects adaptation to an environment where stability mattered deeply. The problem arises when the environment changes, but the identity does not update. A professional operating in high-leverage modern industries, technology, finance, healthcare, innovation, consulting ecosystems, may still carry psychological assumptions designed for far less dynamic economies. The external world rewards scale, ownership, and visibility, while the internal identity continues optimizing for safety and incremental validation. Income changes permanently when risk itself is reinterpreted. Rather than viewing risk solely as potential loss, it begins to be understood as participation in value creation. Remaining within familiar structures carries its own form of risk, the risk of underutilized capacity, stagnant leverage, and dependence on institutional frameworks that define compensation ceilings. This realization rarely arrives dramatically. It emerges gradually as professionals notice peers with comparable intelligence achieving disproportionate financial outcomes through positioning rather than effort. The difference is not talent, but identity permission to engage uncertainty. The identity shift here involves moving from preservation to participation. Preservation protects existing success. Participation engages expanding opportunity. When professionals begin to see themselves not merely as beneficiaries of stable systems, but as contributors capable of shaping outcomes, behavioral patterns change quietly. Risk tolerance increases, not because fear disappears, but because self-concept expands to include adaptability. Decisions become less about protecting a known identity and more about expressing an evolving one. As this shift takes root, income behavior begins to reorganize. Opportunities once dismissed as uncomfortable start appearing intellectually interesting rather than threatening. Negotiations feel less personal and more structural. Ownership becomes psychologically accessible. The ceiling maintained by inherited caution weakens, not through forceful ambition, but through updated understanding. The professional recognizes that the very traits that ensured early success, discipline, intelligence, reliability, can now support a broader economic identity. And with that recognition, income is no longer constrained by the invisible limits of the environment that first defined success. Next, we move deeper into a constraint that rarely appears in financial conversations but consistently shapes earning potential: visibility. Higher income is not only a function of skill or leverage, it is often a function of how visible your value becomes. And visibility introduces psychological complexity. Many thoughtful professionals are comfortable being competent, respected, and even high-performing within defined boundaries. Fewer are fully comfortable being economically prominent, because prominence changes identity. Visibility increases evaluation, it increases scrutiny, it alters how others interpret your decisions, lifestyle, and ambition. When income crosses certain thresholds, subtle social dynamics shift. Colleagues begin to view you differently. Expectations adjust, conversations change tone. Even friendships can recalibrate around perceived financial asymmetry. The mind anticipates these shifts long before they occur. As a result, individuals unconsciously regulate their expansion to avoid relational disruption. This is not insecurity in the traditional sense. It is belonging preservation. Humans evolved to maintain cohesion within their group. Dramatic upward movement can threaten that cohesion. If your peer network largely occupies a certain income bracket, significantly surpassing it may create quiet psychological distance. The internal question emerges: will I still feel like myself among them? Rather than confront that uncertainty, many professionals subtly slow down. They accept incremental increases but resist transformational ones. The ceiling remains intact, not because opportunity is absent, but because visibility feels destabilizing. There is also the issue of status recalibration. As income grows, so does perceived authority. Authority demands decisiveness. It demands ownership of outcomes rather than participation in tasks. For professionals who built their identity around competence and collaboration, stepping into overt authority can feel misaligned. They may unconsciously downplay ambition to preserve an image of groundedness. This behavior is often praised as humility. Yet when humility becomes some self-minimization, it constrains financial trajectory. Imposter cognition intensifies under visibility, not necessarily because of lack of ability, but because identity has not yet scaled to match external recognition. A promotion that multiplies compensation may be interpreted internally as overexposure. The nervous system registers risk in proportion to scale. If identity remains anchored to high-performing contributor, then being perceived as a strategic architect feels like impersonation. To reduce discomfort, behavior contracts. The individual hesitates to negotiate aggressively, declines broader responsibility, or avoids positioning themselves as a central value driver. Visibility also exposes financial ambition itself. In professional environments where moderation is socially rewarded, overt wealth pursuit can feel socially risky. Many upper-middle income professionals prefer to frame decisions around impact, balance, or intellectual challenge rather than income maximization. While these motivations are valid, avoiding explicit financial positioning can obscure leverage opportunities. The discomfort lies not in earning more, but in being seen as someone who intends to earn more. Identity resists any shift that could alter social perception. The subtle truth is that income and visibility are interwoven. Compensation at higher levels often reflects not only execution quality, but symbolic value. Leaders, partners, founders, and principal contributors are paid for decision weight and directional influence. Accepting this role requires psychological readiness to be observed, critiqued, and associated with outcomes at scale. Without identity expansion, visibility feels like exposure rather than alignment. The identity shift here involves reframing visibility from threat to amplification. Being seen is not inherently destabilizing, it is simply a function of increased scope. When professionals internalize that their expanded visibility reflects expanded contribution rather than ego inflation, the discomfort softens. Authority becomes a structural necessity rather than a personality change. Economic prominence becomes a byproduct of value positioning rather than social departure. As this reframing settles, behavioral patterns adjust naturally. Professionals speak with greater clarity about their impact. They negotiate compensation with structural confidence rather than relational anxiety. They step into broader roles without over-interpreting scrutiny. The ceiling that once felt socially necessary begins to dissolve. Income no longer needs to be moderated to preserve belonging. Instead, belonging evolves alongside growth. When visibility is metabolized psychologically, expansion stops feeling like transgression. It feels coherent. And coherence, more than ambition, is what allows income to increase without internal resistance. Now we begin to understand a deeper structural shift that quietly separates incremental earners from exponential earners, the movement from role identity to value identity. Most professionals build their self-concept around the roles they occupy: manager, director, engineer, consultant, physician, analyst. Roles provide clarity. They define scope. They signal competence. They also create boundaries. When identity fuses tightly with role, income becomes tethered to the compensation architecture of that role. You are paid according to position rather than positioning. Role identity is stable and socially legible. It answers the question, "What do you do?" with precision. Yet it rarely answers the more economically significant question, "What value do you create and at what leverage?" The distinction is subtle but decisive. When identity centers on role, income growth depends primarily on vertical progression within predefined ladders. Promotions, title changes, incremental raises, these form the rhythm of expansion. But when identity centers on value, compensation becomes connected to impact scale, scarcity, and ownership. The individual begins to see themselves not merely as someone who performs tasks within a system, but as someone who shapes outcomes across systems. For many upper-middle income professionals, role identity feels secure. It has been reinforced through education, early promotions, and professional recognition. Letting go of it can feel destabilizing because roles provide psychological containment. They reduce ambiguity. A clearly defined job description minimizes exposure. By contrast, value identity introduces open-endedness. It requires asking uncomfortable questions. Where does my contribution truly move the needle? How much revenue, cost reduction, strategic advantage, or innovation is linked to my decisions? If I remove myself from this environment, what measurable difference would occur? These questions shift focus from activity to consequence. This shift can feel confrontational because it exposes leverage disparities. Two professionals may hold similar titles, yet operate at vastly different value scales. One executes reliably within defined parameters, the other influences structural direction. Income eventually reflects that difference. Yet, remaining in role identity allows the first professional to maintain comfort. As long as performance reviews are positive and responsibilities are clear, financial stagnation can be rationalized as market constraint. The ceiling persists because identity remains anchored to function rather than force. Value identity requires psychological permission to think in terms of economic impact. Many professionals hesitate here, not out of incompetence, but out of modest conditioning. Measuring one's work in financial magnitude can feel transactional or self-promotional. Yet markets operate on value translation. If you do not define the economic consequence of your contribution, compensation structures will default to standardized ranges. Income becomes average rather than amplified. There is also a cognitive shift involved. Role identity is backward-looking. It emphasizes credentials, experience, and past performance. Value identity is forward-looking. It emphasizes potential influence and strategic positioning. When professionals internalize value identity, conversations change. Negotiations reference impact rather than tenure. Career decisions prioritize environments where leverage multiplies rather than where titles accumulate. The internal narrative shifts from "I am a senior manager" to "I drive X million in outcomes through Y mechanism." This reframing subtly alters self-perception. The discomfort during this transition often stems from uncertainty. Roles offer predictability. Value positioning involves ambiguity. You may not have a clear template for monetizing impact beyond established salary bands. The identity shift, therefore, precedes structural change. Before income transforms, self-definition must expand to include economic agency. Agency here does not mean entrepreneurship exclusively. It means recognizing that your market worth is not confined to your current job architecture. As professionals adopt value identity, they begin to evaluate opportunities differently. Instead of asking whether a role aligns with their resume progression, they assess whether it increases leverage, ownership, and strategic exposure. Compensation negotiations become less about percentage raises and more about alignment with impact scale. Equity, revenue share, and influence structures become psychologically accessible rather than intimidating. The income ceiling loosens because compensation is no longer anchored solely to hierarchical movement. This transformation is not loud. It does not require dramatic career pivots. It begins internally as a recalibration of how you interpret your own economic presence. When you perceive yourself as a generator of scalable value rather than a participant in predefined roles, behavior adjusts naturally. Conversations become clearer. Boundaries strengthen. Risk assessment becomes more analytical and less emotional. Income responds accordingly, not through force but through congruence. The identity shift that changes income forever often begins here, in the quiet realization that who you are in the market is not your title, but your leverage. Once that realization stabilizes, financial expansion stops feeling like aspiration. It becomes structural alignment. Now the perspective shifts toward a transition that many professionals sense but rarely articulate: the movement from pursuing security to operating through leverage. Early career success is almost entirely built on the pursuit of security. Education provides protection against uncertainty. Stable employment provides predictability. Promotions validate competence. Income rises steadily as reliability compounds. For a significant portion of professional life, this model works exceptionally well. It produces financial stability, social legitimacy, and a coherent sense of progress. Yet at a certain point, the very behaviors that created security begin to limit expansion. Security-based identity evaluates decisions through preservation. The central question becomes, how do I maintain what I have built? Risk is measured primarily by potential loss. Loss of income stability, reputation safety, lifestyle consistency, or professional certainty. This orientation is logical, particularly for individuals who worked deliberately to escape financial vulnerability. But once baseline security has been achieved, continued optimization around preservation produces diminishing financial returns. Income plateaus not because opportunity disappears, but because decision-making remains calibrated for an earlier stage of life. Leverage operates differently. Instead of maximizing stability, leverage maximizes impact relative to effort. It prioritizes positioning over exertion. In modern professional economies, income acceleration increasingly flows toward those whose decisions affect scale, systems, capital allocation, strategic direction, intellectual property, networks, or influence. Yet, psychological readiness for leverage requires relinquishing a purely security-driven identity. And this relinquishment can feel surprisingly uncomfortable. Many professionals notice a quiet tension at mid-career. They work hard, perform well, and earn respectable compensation, yet observe peers achieving disproportionate financial outcomes without proportionally greater effort. The difference often lies not in intelligence, but in leverage orientation. Some individuals gradually shift from being indispensable operators to strategic multipliers. Others remain deeply competent executors. Execution maintains security, leverage expands income. The transition between the two is not primarily technical, it is psychological. Security identity values certainty of effort leading to predictable reward. Leverage identity accepts that effort and reward may temporarily disconnect. Equity compensation may fluctuate. Strategic decisions may take years to manifest financially. Visibility increases without immediate validation. For someone conditioned to equate reliability with success, this environment can feel unstable. The mind interprets ambiguity as risk, even when long-term upside is substantial. To restore emotional comfort, professionals may retreat toward roles where effort-to-income relationships remain linear and visible. Another subtle barrier arises from meritocratic beliefs. Many professionals internalize the idea that income should correlate directly with hard work and measurable productivity. Leverage challenges this assumption. High income at scale often results from positioning, timing, or ownership structures rather than proportional labor. Accepting this reality requires reinterpreting fairness. The identity must expand to include the legitimacy of earning through influence and design rather than effort alone. Without this shift, individuals unconsciously avoid leverage opportunities because they feel psychologically undeserved. The transition from security to leverage also changes how time is perceived. Security-oriented professionals optimize schedules, efficiency, and performance metrics. Leverage-oriented professionals optimize decisions, relationships, and structural positioning. The difference is subtle but transformative. Time spent shaping direction becomes more economically valuable than time spent executing perfectly. Yet embracing this shift requires tolerating reduced clarity about daily productivity, something many high achievers initially resist because productivity has long anchored their self-worth. What ultimately changes income forever is not abandoning security, but redefining it. True security begins to be understood not as stable employment, but as adaptive capacity. The professional recognizes that their long-term stability depends less on institutional structures and more on their ability to create value across contexts. This realization reduces fear around leverage decisions. Risk becomes manageable because identity no longer depends exclusively on any single role or organization. As leverage identity stabilizes, behavioral patterns adjust organically. Professionals become more comfortable participating in decisions that influence outcomes beyond their immediate responsibilities. Negotiations shift toward ownership and upside rather than salary certainty alone. Career moves prioritize asymmetric potential rather than incremental predictability. None of these changes require aggression or radical reinvention. They emerge quietly from an updated internal model of how income actually expands in modern economies. The identity shift here is profound yet understated, moving from protecting earned stability to designing economic influence. When professionals internalize that leverage, not effort alone governs long-term income growth, financial ceilings begin to dissolve. Income ceases to be capped by the need for certainty and instead aligns with the scale of impact one is willing to inhabit. Next, we move deeper into a paradox that many professionals experience but rarely admit openly. Increasing income is not only a financial transition, it is an emotional one. While society often assumes that everyone desires more wealth, the psychological reality is more complex. Becoming significantly wealthier than one's past identity can trigger subtle internal resistance. This resistance does not present itself as rejection of money. Instead, it appears as hesitation, overanalysis, delay, or quiet withdrawal from opportunities that would accelerate financial expansion. Wealth alters emotional equilibrium. Income growth changes how individuals relate to risk, status, relationships, and even self-worth. For professionals raised in environments where financial moderation symbolized virtue, large economic advancement can feel psychologically disorienting. The internal narrative that once defined goodness, being reasonable, grounded, relatable, may appear threatened by visible financial success. Without conscious awareness, the mind begins protecting identity consistency over economic possibility. One overlooked factor is loyalty to origin identity. Many professionals carry an implicit emotional allegiance to the socioeconomic environment in which they were formed. Surpassing that environment dramatically can feel like separation rather than achievement. Wealth introduces difference in lifestyle options, professional autonomy, and social access. The nervous system interprets difference cautiously because belonging has always been a stabilizing force. The individual may not consciously fear wealth itself, but may fear becoming unfamiliar to the people and narratives that shape them. This dynamic often manifests through self-regulation behaviors. A professional may avoid aggressively pursuing compensation adjustments, even when justified. They may hesitate to monetize expertise independently. They may choose roles offering intellectual comfort over financial upside. Each decision appears individually rational, yet collectively maintains economic continuity. Income remains aligned with identity familiarity rather than market potential. The emotional system quietly ensures that life still feels recognizable. Another layer of resistance involves responsibility perception. Higher income frequently implies greater agency, more choices, fewer structural excuses, and increased accountability for how resources are deployed. Paradoxically, expanded freedom can create psychological pressure. When financial constraints diminish, questions about meaning, direction, and long-term purpose become more prominent. Some professionals unconsciously avoid accelerated wealth because limitation provides clarity. Structure defines decisions. Without it, identity must evolve more rapidly. There is also the issue of deservingness. Even highly accomplished individuals may carry subconscious beliefs about who qualifies as wealthy. If wealth has historically been associated with exceptional brilliance, entrepreneurship, or generational advantage, professionals earning through structured careers may feel emotionally misaligned with large financial outcomes. When compensation rises faster than identity adapts, internal discomfort emerges. Rather than updating self-perception immediately, behavior often moderates expansion until psychological alignment is restored. Importantly, this resistance is rarely dramatic. It operates quietly through preference formation. Opportunities requiring bold negotiation feel slightly excessive. Roles demanding visible authority feel slightly premature. Financial risks with asymmetric upside feel slightly unnecessary. The cumulative effect is stabilization. Income grows, but only at a pace that identity can comfortably absorb. The identity shift that changes income forever involves recognizing that emotional readiness, not opportunity scarcity, often determines financial trajectory. Wealth expansion requires allowing oneself to inhabit a different economic self-image without interpreting that evolution as loss of authenticity. Professionals who navigate this transition successfully do not abandon their earlier values, they reinterpret them. Groundedness becomes independence rather than modest limitation. Responsibility becomes stewardship rather than restraint. Success becomes integration rather than departure. As this integration occurs, emotional resistance softens. Larger financial outcomes stop feeling excessive and begin feeling proportional to contribution. Negotiation feels less like confrontation and more like alignment. Opportunity evaluation becomes clearer because decisions are no longer filtered through unconscious loyalty to past identity constraints. The individual recognizes that becoming wealthier does not erase who they were, it expands who they can be. When wealth ceases to threaten identity continuity, income expansion becomes psychologically sustainable. The ceiling maintained by emotional hesitation dissolves quietly, replaced by a calmer relationship with growth itself. And in that calm acceptance, financial trajectory begins to reflect capability rather than comfort. Now we begin to understand how environment functions as one of the most powerful yet least visible regulators of income. Professionals often believe compensation reflects individual performance, negotiation skill, or industry demand. While these factors matter, they operate within environmental boundaries that shape what levels of income feel normal, achievable, and psychologically believable. Human beings rarely evaluate wealth in absolute terms. They evaluate it relative to surrounding expectations. Every professional ecosystem contains an implicit income spectrum. Organizations, industries, cities, and peer groups establish unspoken financial norms. Within these environments, compensation differences exist, but they tend to cluster around recognizable ranges. Over time, individuals internalize these ranges as reality itself. The environment silently communicates what success looks like, what ambition feels appropriate, and how far one can reasonably expand without becoming an outlier. Income stabilizes accordingly. This stabilization occurs through repeated exposure. When most colleagues earn within a certain band, that band becomes cognitively anchored as realistic. Compensation beyond it begins to feel exceptional, even improbable. The mind adapts expectations downward or upward depending on context. A professional surrounded by six-figure earners quickly normalizes that level of income. Similarly, someone operating in environments where seven-figure outcomes are common begins to perceive those outcomes as structurally attainable rather than extraordinary. The difference lies less in talent than in environmental calibration. Environmental influence extends beyond salary visibility. It shapes risk tolerance, conversation topics, and perceived opportunity pathways. In some professional circles, discussing equity ownership or independent capital participation feels ordinary. In others, stability and incremental promotion dominate discourse. Individuals absorb these cues unconsciously. Career decisions then align with what appears socially validated rather than objectively optimal. The environment becomes an invisible decision framework. Many upper-middle income professionals unknowingly remain in environments optimized for stability rather than expansion. These environments reward consistency, collaboration, and institutional loyalty. They provide comfort, intellectual engagement, and respectable compensation. Yet they may lack exposure to asymmetric opportunities. Without witnessing alternative income models regularly, the mind struggles to conceptualize them concretely. Possibility remains theoretical rather than experiential. There is also a psychological comfort embedded in environmental familiarity. Shared assumptions reduce cognitive friction. Professionals feel understood among peers who share similar financial lifestyles and career trajectories. Leaving such environments, even intellectually, can feel destabilizing. Exploring spaces where wealth operates differently introduces comparison anxiety and identity uncertainty. Rather than endure that discomfort, many individuals unconsciously maintain proximity to environments that reinforce existing income patterns. The identity shift that changes income forever often involves environmental repositioning before behavioral change. This does not necessarily require changing jobs or industries immediately. It begins with exposure. Exposure recalibrates expectation. When professionals consistently observe individuals operating at higher leverage levels, earning stars once perceived as rare begin to feel structurally normal. The psychological ceiling rises quietly. Ambition stops feeling exceptional because the environment confirms its legitimacy. Importantly, environment influences not only aspiration, but self-perception. Humans construct identity through reflected feedback. When surrounded by peers operating at similar economic levels, identity stabilizes around that norm. When exposed to environments where strategic thinking, ownership, and scale are standard, identity begins adapting to match those expectations. Behavior follows naturally. Negotiation confidence increases. Opportunity recognition sharpens. Financial imagination expands. Income rarely outpaces environmental belief systems for long. Even dramatic financial gains tend to regress if the surrounding environment reinforces smaller norms. Conversely, sustained exposure to expanded economic ecosystems gradually normalizes higher earning capacity. The professional does not force ambition, they absorb it. Growth feels less like striving and more like alignment with context. Understanding environmental influence reframes income growth from purely individual effort to contextual positioning. The question shifts from how can I work harder to what environments shape my understanding of possibility. When professionals intentionally engage environments that stretch their perception of normal, identity begins to recalibrate. And as identity recalibrates, income range expands without internal conflict. The ceiling dissolves not through pressure, but through exposure to a broader definition of what a professional life can economically become. Next, we move deeper into a behavior that appears tactical on the surface, but is often identity-driven underneath: negotiation avoidance. Among thoughtful professionals, negotiation is rarely rejected outright. Instead, it is softened. Requests are phrased cautiously, compensation conversations are delayed, counteroffers are considered but not fully articulated. The individual remains reasonable, collaborative, and measured. Yet over time, this restraint compounds into significant financial divergence. Negotiation avoidance is seldom about ignorance of market value. Most upper-middle-income professionals possess the analytical capacity to assess their economic worth. They understand benchmarks. They recognize performance differentials. What constrains negotiation intensity is often emotional coherence. Asking for substantially more compensation forces an explicit declaration of value. It requires translating contribution into financial magnitude without apology. For individuals whose identity emphasizes modesty, cooperation, or intellectual humility, this translation can feel misaligned. The discomfort is subtle. It may manifest as concern about appearing difficult. It may appear as fear of damaging relationships with superiors. It may surface as rational timing arguments: "I will ask next cycle," or "this is not the right quarter." These explanations feel strategic, yet beneath them lies a deeper identity boundary. Asserting economic leverage challenges the narrative of being agreeable and grounded. The individual unconsciously protects social identity at the expense of financial acceleration. There is also a cognitive bias embedded in meritocratic environments. Many professionals assume that high performance will be recognized and rewarded proportionally without forceful articulation. This belief is partially reinforced by early career experiences where incremental raises followed visible effort. But at higher income levels, compensation becomes more negotiable and more strategic. Value is often rewarded in proportion to how clearly it is positioned, not merely how effectively it is delivered. Without explicit negotiation, compensation frequently defaults to standardized ranges. Negotiation avoidance is further reinforced by risk sensitivity. The potential downside, tension, rejection, reputational friction, is emotionally salient. The upside, while rationally appealing, may feel abstract. The nervous system prioritizes immediate relational harmony over long-term financial expansion. Even small hesitations accumulate. A percentage point here, an unclaimed bonus there, equity left unexplored. These decisions compound across years into structural income ceilings. What makes this dynamic particularly persistent is that it aligns with positive character traits. Professionals who avoid aggressive negotiation are often praised as team-oriented and stable. They maintain goodwill. They avoid conflict. These qualities enhance reputation within organizations optimized for collaboration. Yet collaboration does not automatically translate into optimized compensation. The identity shift required here involves separating interpersonal warmth from economic clarity. One can remain measured and respectful while also asserting structural value. At a deeper level, negotiation forces confrontation with one's own valuation. To request a higher compensation package is to declare implicitly that one's impact exceeds current pricing. If identity has not fully integrated value identity, the understanding that contribution can be quantified in economic terms, the request feels inflated, even when justified. The individual may intellectually agree with the numbers, yet emotionally under-identify with them. To reduce internal dissonance, they moderate the ask. The identity shift that changes income permanently reframes negotiation from connotation to calibration. Rather than viewing compensation discussion as personal assertion, it becomes structural alignment between value and reward. When professionals internalize that negotiation is a neutral economic process rather than a personality statement, emotional resistance diminishes. Clarity replaces hesitation. Language becomes direct without aggression. Over time, this recalibration transforms income trajectory, not through dramatic one-time leaps, but through consistent alignment. Raises become proportional to impact. Equity participation becomes deliberate rather than incidental. Career moves are evaluated through compensation structure as much as title prestige. The ceiling maintained by negotiation restraint gradually dissolves because identity no longer equates assertiveness with social risk. Income expansion often depends less on extraordinary opportunity and more on ordinary conversations handled with clarity. When professionals update their self-concept to include the legitimacy of asserting economic value, negotiation stops feeling like deviation. It becomes coherence. And coherence, repeated across years, reshapes income permanently. Now the perspective shifts toward a phenomenon increasingly common among modern professionals: financial success occurring faster than psychological adaptation. Many individuals achieve levels of income, status, and professional influence that earlier versions of themselves could not have imagined, yet internally they continue operating from an outdated identity. Externally, success is visible. Internally, self-perception remains anchored to an earlier stage of life. This mismatch creates one of the most powerful invisible ceilings on future income growth. Identity does not update automatically when circumstances change. Promotions arrive, compensation rises, and responsibilities expand, but the internal narrative often lags behind reality. A professional may still feel like the cautious early career contributor, even while occupying a strategic leadership position. They may intellectually acknowledge success while emotionally relating to themselves as someone still proving legitimacy. The result is behavioral inconsistency. Decisions are made from past identity within present opportunity. When identity lags behind achievement, expansion feels fragile. Success appears temporary rather than structural. The mind interprets financial progress as something that must be protected rather than extended. This protective stance influences career behavior subtly. Individuals prioritize maintaining their current position over positioning for greater leverage. They become excellent maintainers of success, but hesitant expanders of it. Income stabilizes because identity seeks confirmation of belonging rather than exploration of scale. This dynamic often manifests through overqualification behavior. Professionals continue accumulating credentials, validation, or reassurance long after competence has been demonstrated. The internal logic suggests preparation for future opportunity, yet psychologically it functions as identity delay. Expansion is postponed until self-perception feels sufficiently justified. Ironically, external systems may already view the individual as fully capable of operating at a higher economic level. The only remaining barrier is internal recognition. Another consequence of identity lag is risk asymmetry perception. Opportunities aligned with higher income frequently involve uncertainty or visibility. If identity still frames the individual as someone fortunate to have reached their current level, potential advancement appears disproportionately risky. Loss looms larger than gain. The professional unconsciously defends current success rather than compounding it. Income plateaus not because opportunity disappears, but because identity interprets expansion as jeopardizing hard-earned stability. Social reinforcement deepens this pattern. Colleagues and networks formed during earlier career stages may continue reflecting older versions of identity back to the individual. Familiar interactions reinforce familiar self-concepts. Without intentional recalibration, external success coexists with internal modesty that gradually becomes constraint. The professional remains respected and comfortable, yet economically underextended relative to capability. The identity shift required here is not confidence in the motivational sense. It is recognition. Recognition that past effort has already transformed capability and positioning. Recognition that current income reflects demonstrated value rather than temporary luck. Recognition that maintaining an outdated self-image quietly restricts future possibility. This shift involves allowing internal identity to catch up with external reality. When identity updates, behavioral patterns change almost imperceptibly. Professionals stop over-explaining their worth. They evaluate opportunities based on alignment rather than permission. Strategic risks feel proportionate rather than threatening. Negotiations reflect present impact instead of past insecurity. The internal narrative moves from "I hope to belong here" to "I operate here." Income expansion becomes sustainable because it no longer feels like deviation from self-understanding. Importantly, this transition does not require abandoning humility. Humility can coexist with accurate self-recognition. The difference lies in eliminating unnecessary psychological distance between who you are and what you have already demonstrated. Once identity integrates success fully, energy previously spent maintaining self-doubt becomes available for strategic thinking. Growth feels calmer, less urgent, and more deliberate. Income changes permanently when identity stops referencing outdated versions of self. Financial ceilings often persist because individuals continue negotiating with the world as who they used to be rather than who they have become. Updating identity removes that friction. Expansion becomes a continuation rather than a leap. And when internal self-perception aligns with external capability, income trajectory begins to reflect reality instead of memory. Next, we move deeper into the point where identity stops being a psychological background factor and becomes an active economic strategy. Up to this stage, identity has operated quietly, shaping risk tolerance, negotiation behavior, environmental choices, and definitions of enough. But there comes a phase in professional life when identity itself becomes the primary driver of income trajectory. Not skills, not effort, not even opportunity. The way you understand who you are begins determining which economic realities become accessible. Many professionals reach mid-career possessing strong expertise, stable networks, and credible reputations. At this level, technical differentiation narrows. Most peers are competent. Most work hard. Most understand their industry. Income divergence increasingly reflects how individuals position themselves psychologically within the market, rather than how much they know. Some professionals begin operating as economic actors who shape outcomes. Others continue operating as participants awaiting recognition. The distinction originates in identity orientation. When identity matures into strategy, professionals stop asking where they fit and begin asking where value concentrates. Attention shifts from role fulfillment toward leverage mapping. Instead of defining themselves through organizational hierarchy, they define themselves through economic influence. They notice where decisions create disproportionate results, where scarcity exists, and where ownership intersects with expertise. Career choices become less reactive and more architectural. This shift does not require aggression or reinvention. It requires clarity about personal economic positioning. The professional begins recognizing patterns. Certain conversations lead to opportunity, certain environments compound influence, Certain collaborations expand reach beyond individual effort. Rather than drifting through these patterns, identity integrates them intentionally. One no longer waits to be positioned. One participates in positioning. Income begins responding to structural awareness rather than incremental progression. A critical component of this transformation involves detachment from institutional identity dependence. Earlier career stages encourage deep alignment with organizational belonging. Titles, company prestige, and internal recognition serve as primary sources of validation. As identity evolves, professionals begin separating self-worth from institutional context. The organization becomes a platform rather than a definition. This psychological separation increases mobility, not necessarily through job changes, but through cognitive independence. Decisions become guided by long-term economic alignment rather than short-term organizational comfort. There is often a quiet psychological turning point here. The individual recognizes that income growth is no longer constrained by capability, but by self-permission. They begin allowing themselves to occupy larger economic spaces without waiting for unanimous external validation. Strategic visibility becomes acceptable. Ownership conversations feel natural. Compensation discussions reflect structural contribution rather than gratitude for opportunity. The professional is no longer negotiating from aspiration, but from alignment. Identity as strategy also alters time perception. Instead of focusing primarily on immediate performance cycles, professionals begin thinking in multi-year economic narratives. Relationships are cultivated for long-term leverage. Skills are chosen for durability rather than immediate utility. Decisions prioritize positioning within expanding systems rather than maximizing short-term certainty. Income accelerates because actions compound strategically rather than sequentially. Importantly, this phase is marked by calm rather than urgency. The identity shift reduces internal friction. There is less need to prove, impress, or chase validation. Economic decisions become clearer because they reflect internal coherence. Professionals stop oscillating between ambition and hesitation. They operate from integrated understanding of their market role. Others perceive this clarity intuitively, often interpreting it as leadership presence or executive maturity. Compensation structures frequently follow this perception. The transformation is subtle yet decisive. Identity moves from passive self-concept to active economic instrument. Who you believe yourself to be determines the scale of problems you engage, the environments you enter, and the compensation structures you accept. Once identity functions strategically, income growth stops feeling unpredictable. It becomes an expression of alignment between internal narrative and external opportunity. At this stage, financial expansion no longer requires constant effort escalation. Instead, it reflects accumulated positioning choices shaped by an updated self-understanding. The professional realizes that wealth accumulation was never purely about working harder or learning more. It was about becoming psychologically compatible with larger economic participation. And once identity aligns with that participation, income evolves as a natural consequence rather than a distant objective. Now we arrive at the deeper integration point, the moment when income stops behaving like a target and begins behaving like a reflection. Throughout professional life, most individuals attempt to change financial outcomes by adjusting behavior, working harder, optimizing performance, acquiring additional credentials, or searching for better opportunities. These actions matter, yet they rarely produce permanent transformation unless identity evolves alongside them. The true shift occurs when a professional no longer experiences wealth expansion as an external pursuit, but as an internal alignment. At this stage, something subtle changes in perception. Money stops representing validation. Earlier in career development, income often functions as proof of intelligence, effort, progress, or social mobility. Compensation becomes emotionally charged because it confirms self-worth narratives formed years earlier. But once identity stabilizes, income loses its symbolic weight. It becomes informational rather than emotional, a number reflecting market positioning rather than personal legitimacy. This psychological neutrality is what allows income to expand sustainably. Without emotional overattachment, decisions become clearer. Negotiation feels calmer. Risk assessment becomes analytical rather than protective. The identity shift that changes income forever is not about becoming more ambitious. It is about becoming internally congruent with larger economic participation. Professionals who undergo this shift stop asking whether they deserve more and begin evaluating whether their positioning accurately reflects their contribution. This distinction transforms behavior. Instead of hesitating at thresholds that once felt excessive, they recognize those thresholds as structural milestones. Growth no longer feels like departure from self, it feels like expression of capability. A noticeable outcome of this shift is reduced internal noise. The constant comparison with peers softens. Anxiety about appearing successful diminishes. Decisions stop revolving around external perception. When identity is secure, visibility no longer threatens belonging. Wealth becomes integrated into self-understanding rather than existing as a separate identity layer that must be justified or hidden. Professionals begin operating with quiet authority, not performative confidence, but psychological steadiness. Markets tend to reward this steadiness because it signals clarity of value. Another transformation occurs in how opportunity is recognized. Earlier, opportunities were evaluated primarily through safety or prestige. After identity integration, opportunities are evaluated through alignment with leverage and long-term positioning. The professional naturally gravitates toward environments where contribution scales. Compensation structures expand because decisions consistently favor economic architecture over short-term reassurance. Income growth appears almost inevitable, not because luck improves, but because internal resistance has diminished. Importantly, this shift does not produce urgency or relentless pursuit of wealth. In many cases, professionals report feeling calmer precisely as income increases. The psychological struggle around money dissolves. Financial decisions feel less reactive. Consumption becomes more intentional. Career movement becomes more deliberate. Wealth stops being something to chase and becomes something that accumulates as a byproduct of coherent participation in complex systems. What changes permanently is not merely income level, but relationship to money itself. Fear of loss weakens because identity is no longer anchored to a specific role or environment. Confidence arises from adaptability rather than position. The professional understands that their earning capacity travels with them, rooted in perspective, leverage awareness, and strategic self-understanding. This realization removes the invisible ceiling that once governed decisions. Income becomes fluid because identity is no longer confined. The paradox is that the final stage feels remarkably ordinary. There is no dramatic breakthrough moment. No singular achievement marks the transition. Instead, life begins to feel quieter internally. Decisions require less negotiation with self-doubt. Opportunities that once felt intimidating now feel proportionate. Financial expansion unfolds gradually yet persistently, sustained not by effort intensity, but by psychological alignment. The identity has expanded enough to hold a different economic reality without resistance. And perhaps this is the most overlooked truth about wealth among thoughtful professionals. Income changes permanently when self-perception changes permanently. External strategies may initiate progress, but identity determines sustainability. When you understand yourself as a participant in value creation rather than a recipient of compensation, financial growth ceases to be episodic. It becomes structural. If these reflections felt familiar, it may be because this conversation was never about money alone. It was about understanding the quiet psychological architecture shaping professional life, the unseen beliefs guiding decisions long before outcomes appear. And if this way of thinking resonates with you, you are invited to continue exploring these ideas with us here at Mindful Wealth. Consider subscribing and sharing this conversation with someone who approaches success thoughtfully, someone who senses that wealth is not only built through action, but through understanding.